Good evening. My name is Eric Guttag, and welcome to my talk entitled Devotion, a story of friendship and comradeship formed across race. If you have any questions or comments during this talk, please feel free to fire away at any time. The subject of war is not new to my Black History Month talks. 4 of my prior talks discussed the significant impact of African Americans on our military, from General Benjamin O. Davis Jr. of Tuskegee Airman fame to General Colin Powell, who is perhaps our greatest chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As I also noted in my 2014 talk, African Americans have fought in all our major conflicts, starting with our first, the Revolutionary War. But what is distinctly different about this year's talk is which conflict our main characters fought in. Of all the conflicts that America has been involved in, the Korean War is the one that has almost been forgotten. In fact, it is often referred to as the forgotten Korean War. It began when North Korea invaded South Korea by crossing their common artificial border in late June of 1950. Now, for a half-price gift card, can anyone tell me the name of that artificial border?
93rd Meridian or something?
38th parallel is correct. Almost. There you go. Yep. Enjoy. The Korean War also has personal significance for me in at least 2 ways. First, I was born in January of 1952 after it had been raging for 1.5 years. It would sadly continue another 1.5 years before being halted by an armistice in late July of 1953. Second, my late uncle, Don F. Salmons, at the age of 17, became a member of the 1092nd Engineer Combat Battalion that fought in that conflict. Our story tonight will also focus on a different branch of America's armed services. It involves 2 naval aviators who fought in the early stages of the Korean War. One was Jesse Brown, a member of a large and extremely poor sharecropper family in segregated Mississippi. Brown became the first black aviator to complete the U.S. Navy's flight training program. The other was Tom Hudner, who grew up in white privilege in Massachusetts. He graduated from the Naval Academy in my former home state of Maryland. Brown and Hudner would become fellow members of the Fighting 32 Squadron, flying Corsairs off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Leyte. The Gullwing Corsair was developed during World War II. It was greatly feared by Japanese pilots who gave it an unusual nickname because of the sound it made when it dived. For another half-price book gift card, can anyone tell me what that nickname was? You're getting close. The initials are WD. Still get it. Whistling Death. Whistling Death. Oh yeah, I made this sound. Made a whistle. Oh, here you go. Yeah, that's okay. Close enough. By the time of the Korean conflict, Corsairs were becoming obsolete, now greatly outclassed by much faster jet fighters. One of those jet fighters was flown in Korea by America's adversaries in that conflict. For my final half-price book gift card, can anyone tell me the name of that jet fighter and which country made it? Huh? Yep, you got, that's good enough. MiG-15. There you go. Yep. The Soviets made that fighter. You'll find out more about it later. Even though they came from very different geographical, racial, and cultural backgrounds, Brown and Hudner would become brothers in arms before and then during the Korean War. In fact, they were so devoted to each other that when Brown was forced to crash land his Corsair in enemy territory, Hudner would deliberately land his Corsair nearby to try to rescue him. In doing so, Hudner risked not only court-martial, but also his own death. With that premise, let's explore this incredible story of friendship and comradeship, one formed across the boundary of race that endured the hell known as the Korean War. Jesse Leroy Brown was born on October 13, 1926 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He was one of 5 sons and 1 daughter born to John Brown, a former grocery warehouse worker, and Julia Lindsay Brown, a school teacher. A former trooper in an all-black cavalry unit during World War I, John was solidly built at just under 6 feet tall and 250 pounds. He became a sharecropper in Lux, Mississippi in 1938 when he lost his job in a turpentine factory. Jesse, along with his 2 younger brothers, Lura and Fletcher, helped work the fields with their father, John, just to survive, especially as it was the Great Depression. John rented the 30 acres he worked from a white landowner, Joe Bob Ingram. Ingram also owned the town's general store where the sharecroppers like John rented their tools and bought their seed. The work days were long for Jesse, his 2 younger brothers, and their father, especially during planting season. Chopping plants made for 11-hour days, with backs aching and hands covered in blisters. One very hot day before heading home to do chores, Jesse, spurred by a plea from Lura, got their father to let them go swimming. They reached the muddy pond, which they jumped in. While walking home after their swim, they encountered a bus full of white kids. Several of them shouted racial slurs and then spit on them. Following this humiliating incident of racial hostility, an angry Lura then spoke what Jesse was also thinking. What I want to be when I grow up is a Greyhound bus driver, so I can get the hell out of Mississippi. Several days later, Jesse decided to make a point about this demeaning experience. When that same bus came by, Jesse picked up a long corn stalk. He then swung it, smacking the first face that jutted from the windows. The bus then stopped. The angry bus driver got out and asked what had happened. Jesse politely informed him that every day when you pass us, those boys stick their heads out and spit on us. After carefully studying Jesse and his brothers standing nearby, the bus driver then said, "Well, that won't happen anymore." On getting back in the bus, the driver slammed the door and then chewed those kids out. One day, Jesse was working in the field with his brothers when an airplane dived down from the sky. As others hit the dirt, Jesse turned just in time to see a sleek blue airplane traveling toward him at treetop height. He too ducked and dropped to earth. As the plane roared over him and climbed, Jesse stood up and studied it. When that plane circled back for another pass, the others again hit the dirt, but not Jesse. He stared right at the incoming plane, realizing it was a B-T-9 trainer aircraft. While the others suggested the pilot was out to get them, Jesse simply grinned and said, he was just having fun. When I get my plane, I'll probably do the same thing to you. Jesse's fascination with this trainer aircraft was not a surprise. The itch to fly was ignited in him at the age of 6 when his father took him to an air show. He would often visit the dirt airfield near his home. Reading newspapers and magazines such as Popular Aviation heavily influenced his desire to fly naval aircraft. He especially focused on stories about black aviators that included C. Alfred Anderson, Eugene Jacques Bullard, and Bessie Coleman. In 1943, Jesse stayed in Hattiesburg with his aunt and uncle to attend a better high school for blacks called Eureka High School. He became an athlete, competing in basketball, football, and track and field. He was also an outstanding student, graduating as a salutatorian in 1944. It was during this time that Jesse met his future wife, Daisy Pearl Nix. Jesse was urged by his principal, Nathaniel Berger, to attend an all-black college, but Jesse had other ideas. Instead, following in the footsteps of his childhood role model, Jesse Owens, Jesse Brown became a Buckeye, entering the Ohio State University. To pay for expenses, he waited tables at the Holmes Club, a bar for white soldiers only. While working there, Jesse sometimes needed to dodge a fist fight or deal with a drunken soldier's racial slurs, but he simply shrugged them off. Jesse initially began as an architectural engineering major at OSU. He also joined the track and field as well as the wrestling teams, but soon dropped out for financial reasons. To pay for his schooling, Jesse took a job as a janitor at a local Lazarus department store. He was also hired to load boxcars from late afternoon to midnight. Nonetheless, he maintained top grades in his classes. But Jesse still yearned to fly, so he applied to OSU's aviation program. Unfortunately, he was denied entry because he was black. Undaunted, during his sophomore year, Jesse became aware of the V-5 Aviation Cadet Training Program offered by the U.S. Navy for naval aviation pilots. Despite resistance to a black applying for this program, he passed the entrance exams. On July 8, 1946, Jesse enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve and was admitted to the aviation program to train as a naval aviator. In 1947, he also received his architectural degree from OSU. Even so, that was just the beginning of Jesse's daunting path to become a naval aviator. Growing up in New England, the other main character in our story chose a very different path to become a naval aviator. Thomas J. Hudner, Jr. was born on August 31, 1924, in Fall River, Massachusetts, the eldest of 4 brothers. Tom's father owned a chain of grocery stores. Morton Junior High School, which Tom attended as an 8th grader, was a place of rules and playground codes. Indeed, Tom was a rule follower by nature, sitting with other boys and away from the girls. To do otherwise would invite ridicule. Even so, Tom was exposed at the age of 13 to racial conflict. Outside the cafeteria, the school's bullies gathered in a corner of the courtyard where kids played after lunch. Those bullies were immigrant kids, dark-skinned sons of Portuguese fishermen who had settled in Fall River. Tom spotted these bullies tossing around a pair of eyeglasses belonging to a boy named Jack. Tom looked around for a teacher to help with this difficult situation, but none was to be seen. After pleading with his balking table mates to help, Tom went outside to deal with these bullies alone. After telling them, "I don't think Jack is enjoying this very much," the gang's leader, Manny Cabral, came over to confront Tom. Meanwhile, Jack had finally retrieved his glasses. Too terrified to throw the first punch, Tom merely shuffled his feet. But Manny's expression loosened as he raised his chin and dropped his fists. Surprisingly, he then stepped toward Tom and thrust forward his right hand with his palm open. After Manny told him to go ahead, shake, Tom unclenched his fist and reached out to take Manny's hand in his to shake it. Manny then turned to the other gang members, telling them, "He's okay. It's all right between us," and walked away. His speechless gang members then followed after him. When he got home, Tom tossed his books on his desk and flopped onto the bed. It then dawned on him, what if Manny had not been such a good guy after all? Realizing this tense situation could have cost him his front teeth, a humbled Tom thought to himself, never again. But he would also learn a lesson that would come into play much later when he first met Jesse Brown. In 1939, Tom would enter the prestigious Phillips Academy at Andover in the Bay State. Being educated at Phillips Academy was a family tradition. The eldest, Hudner, as well as Tom's uncle, had graduated from there. Tom's three younger brothers would also go to Phillips Academy. While at Phillips Academy, Tom was active in a number of organizations. In athletics, he was captain of the track team, as well as a member of the football and lacrosse teams. In addition, Tom was a class officer, member of student council, and an assistant house counselor. Because his father had attended Harvard, Tom had also pre-registered to enter that school in 1943. But following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Tom was inspired by a speech from the headmaster at Phillips Academy to apply to the U.S. Naval Academy. He was accepted in 1943. Among his classmates was James Earl Carter, Jr., later to become the 39th President of the United States. While at the Naval Academy, Tom would play football, eventually becoming a starting running back for the junior varsity team. World War II ended in August of 1945. Tom graduated from the Naval Academy almost a year later in May of 1946. His initial posting was to the heavy cruiser USS Helena. Nothing to this point suggested an interest in naval aviation. After getting terribly sick in the back seat of an SNJ trainer, Tom initially decided he just wasn't built for flying. But just 3 months later, while quaffing drinks with his buddies, he was goaded into applying to flight school. In 1948, he was accepted for flight training at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. After he completed basic flight training there, Tom transferred to the Naval Air Station at Corpus Christi, Texas. There he completed advanced flight training and qualified as a naval aviator in August of 1949. In an earlier talk, I discussed the famed Tuskegee Airmen. Officially known as the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the Tuskegee Airmen later became the vaunted 332nd Fighter Group in World War II. But to the German Luftwaffe, they were better known as the feared Red Tails because the vertical stabilizer of their P-51 Mustangs was painted a distinctive red. They were led by the redoubtable General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the first African American to graduate from West Point. Davis and the Tuskegee Airmen faced and overcame significant challenges. That included convincing an all-white Congress that African Americans, as a group, could be competent combat pilots. But Jesse Brown's effort to become the first black aviator to complete the U.S. Navy's flight training program was more analogous to that of Jackie Robinson. Robinson would become the first African American to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball when he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. In doing so, Robinson endured numerous racial slurs or worse that included death threats in playing for the Dodgers. Even more analogous to Jesse's situation, Robinson had been drafted into a segregated Army cavalry unit during World War II. Because of his race, Robinson fought mightily to be accepted into officer candidate school, eventually becoming commissioned as a second lieutenant. Just getting into the V-5 Aviation Cadet Training Program was tough enough for Jesse as an African American. But similar to Jackie Robinson's experience in breaking into Major League Baseball, entering as the only black in that program was a huge challenge. Jesse would be the sole black face amongst a sea of white faces. And like Robinson, Jesse could expect to be harassed and insulted by white instructors as well as his fellow white trainees. Initially, in March of 1947, Jesse went to the Naval Air Station at Glenview, Illinois for flight training and to be appointed as a midshipman. He began learning to fly in a Stearman N2S trainer aircraft. In April, Jesse would transfer to the Naval Air Station at Ottumwa, Iowa, for the next phase of his training. That included not only technical, but also intensive physical training. But the Naval Air Station at Ottumwa was about to be closed. So Jesse and his surviving fellow trainees were transferred to the Naval Air Station at Pensacola in June. Jesse would find the flight training there a daunting challenge. Unlike Tom, who would follow him later to Pensacola, Jesse endured overt racism from at least one flight instructor, as well as several of his fellow trainees. He was often the recipient of a significant amount of negative feedback on his ability to fly. Indeed, Jesse would often wonder whether he was cut out to be a naval aviator. The washout rate, as those who were dropped from the program was colloquially called, was extremely high. During these times of discouragement, Jesse's morale was frequently buoyed by his fellow trainee and midshipman, Jack Kiefer. Even though he was Virginia-born, Jack could care less that Jesse was black. Somewhat of a free spirit, they would become bosom buddies during their training and beyond. Jack also had a wife called Joan to whom he was secretly married. That was because marriage was a no-no for midshipmen. Speaking of marriage, after graduating from pre-flight school at Pensacola, Jesse got a weekend pass and flew back to Hattiesburg. While there, Jesse walked up in uniform to the house where Daisy was sitting in front of the window. On seeing Jesse, a joyful Daisy ran out. But Jesse now sprung a surprise on her. They were going to get married that very day. Like the Kiefers, Daisy and Jesse now entered into a secret marriage. Jesse also arranged for Daisy to be boarded discreetly at a widow's home near the Naval Air Station at Pensacola. After much heartache and relentless training that included daunting carrier landings and takeoffs from the USS Wright, Jesse finally received his wings of gold on October 21, 1948. That signified his completion of flight training. On April 26, 1949, he became not only a U.S. Navy ensign, but also the first commissioned African-American naval aviator. No longer would he and Daisy have to hide their marital status. Meanwhile, Jesse had also become a dad. After a difficult pregnancy, Daisy gave birth in December of 1948 to their daughter named Pamela Elise. Pam, as she was called, was a bundle of joy to her parents. All right. Sorry, I got a little behind there. By January of 1949, Jesse was a member of Fighter Squadron 32, or VF-32. VF-32 was better known as the Fighting 32. It was located at the Naval Air Station on Quonset Point, Rhode Island. Almost a year later, in December of 1949, Tom would also become a member of the Fighting 32. The commander of the Fighting 32 was Lieutenant Commander Richard Dick Savoli. Savoli was a 30-year-old combat veteran. During World War II, he had scored a disabling hit on a Japanese aircraft carrier during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Savoli was also credited with 4 confirmed kills along with 3 probables. Savoli assigned Tom to fly with him and Jesse. Even though Tom outranked Jesse, who was only an ensign, Jesse would be the lead if it was just the 2 of them based upon him having more flight hours. Savoli asked if Tom would have any trouble taking orders from a Negro pilot. Tom assured him that that was fine. At my high school, we only had 1 colored kid, and I was friends with him. A few days later, Tom would meet Jesse in the Fighting 32 locker room. The initial meeting was awkward and tense, but Tom remembered the lesson he had learned from dealing with Manny Cabral, the Portuguese gang leader. A man would reveal his character through his actions, not his skin color. So after tying his boots and standing up, Tom would say, "Good to meet you, Jesse. I'm Tom Hudner." Tom would then thrust his open hand out. Jesse looked down at Tom's hand, paused, and then extended his hand and shook. Even so, Tom spotted Tom's Naval Academy ring. From that glance, Tom knew it would take time for them to be comfortable as fellow naval aviators. In 1949, the Fighting 32 flew the fighter known as the Bearcat. They had also been deemed the top squadron in the fleet that year. A white E was painted on each Bearcat in the squadron. In early 1950, the Fighting 32 was redesignated as a ground attack squadron. Their lighter Bearcats were now replaced with the heavier gull-winged Corsair. Each Corsair had 60 50 caliber machine guns and a top speed of over 400 miles per hour. Its longest nose made it a tricky plane for takeoff and especially landing on aircraft carriers. Indeed, the Corsair did not become common on aircraft carriers until 1944. During World War II, the Corsair was a formidable fighter. That was why the Japanese nicknamed it the Whistling Death. But by the late 1940s, the Corsair was showing its age. The Soviet Union was now producing, in large quantities, the Mikoyan Gurevich 15, better known as the MiG-15. A swept-wing jet fighter, the MiG-15 flew almost 300 miles per hour faster than the Corsair. Even the Panther, that the U.S. Navy then flew as a jet fighter, was still almost 100 miles per hour slower than the MiG-15. The Corsairs of the Fighting 32 were now used as ground support bombers. In that capacity, it still provided an awesome firepower with its 6 machine guns. It could also fire up to 8 high-velocity rockets, plus drop upwards of 4,000 pounds of conventional bombs or incendiary napalm. But as Jesse would learn, takeoff and especially landing a Corsair on a carrier flight deck wasn't easy. On a cloudy and windy day in early April of 1950, Jesse was to bring his Corsair in for his 6th and qualifying landing on the USS Wright. Meanwhile, Tom was crowded with others on the observation deck, known grimly as Vulture Row. Being heavier with its longish nose that obstructed the pilot's forward view, landing a Corsair on a windswept and heaving carrier was far from trivial. In fact, Jesse had already been waved off twice from landing on the Wright. Coming in for his 3rd try, Jesse wanted to catch one of the 9 cables with the landing hook trailing from the rear of his Corsair. He was also watching the landing signal officer, or LSO, holding 2 paddles as signals. When Jesse's Corsair was 50 feet from the rear of the carrier deck, the LSO flipped the right paddle across his chest. That signaled him to cut his engine and land. But something didn't look right to Jesse, so he hesitated. Only as the arresting cables came under his Corsair did Jesse finally dip down towards the deck. As the wheels of his Corsair touched down, his landing hook was now well past all the cables. He had also soared over the final crash barrier. Jesse's Corsair then veered to the right and dropped out of sight. Miraculously, the men on the right saw his Corsair skim over the waves and climb upward for his 4th try at landing on the right. After this nearly fatal crash, Jesse successfully landed his Corsair on this 4th try. With 6 landings under his belt, he was now qualified as a naval aviator. But Jesse also knew how the LSO would describe his barrier bounce, DNKUA, which translates as damn near killed us all. He would also hear it from the other pilots. One of those pilots, Marty Goody, put his arm around a squeamish Jesse who tried unsuccessfully to get away. Marty then made the following pronouncement. They say there are 2 kinds of aviators in the Navy. Those who have hit the barrier and those who will someday hit it. But I think there's a 3rd. Jesse Brown. When he sees a barrier, he jumps it. The pilots all broke out in laughter, and even Jesse had a smirk. Marty, being Jewish, felt kinship with Jesse because they both had endured prejudice. But despite the levity created by Marty, Jesse understood the sober reality. He had damn nearly killed himself. The Fighting 32 was eventually assigned to the USS Leyte. Launched at the end of World War II, the Leyte was a large Essex-class aircraft carrier. It had a crew of almost 3,500 men. Its engines could speed it through the water at upwards of 38 miles per hour, or if you're in naval terms, 33 knots. Besides the Fighting 32, there were several other squadrons. Upwards of 90 to 100 planes would call the Leyte home. On May 2, 1950, Jesse, Tom, and the other members of the Fighting 32 were clustered beside the Leyte. It was about to leave port. There were many tearful farewells, including Jesse, as he said goodbye to Daisy and their almost 1.5-year-old daughter, Pam. After embarking on the Leyte, the Fighting 32 headed to the Mediterranean to join the U.S. Sixth Fleet, also known as the Dancing Fleet. Almost 3 weeks later, the Leyte reached Sicily. Tensions were already high regarding the new adversary to democracy, the USSR. NATO was trying to keep the Soviets at bay in the Mediterranean. Indeed, there was concern that the USSR might try to topple the governments of either Greece or Turkey to secure a warm water port. Meanwhile, the members of the Fighting 32 would conduct training exercises that included aerial gunnery practice. That required one of the pilots to tow a banner behind their plane for the other pilots to shoot at. As the shakiest pilot in the squadron and eager to make friends, Carol Mooring volunteered to tow it. After gunnery practice was over, he dropped the banner and came in to land on the Lady. But then tragedy struck. On approaching the Lady, Mooring's Corsair stalled. It then crashed into the sea, turned over, floating upside down. Other members of the Fighting 32 gazed out in horror at the stricken plane. Sadly, within minutes, Mooring's Corsair sank beneath the waves, taking its pilot with it. It was a cruel reminder to Tom, Jesse, and the others that theirs was a deadly business. On June 25, 1950, the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The Lady was then off the west coast of Italy. Tom, Jesse, and the rest of their comrades had been asleep below deck, but no longer. Lieutenant Commander Doug Neal, the skipper of all squadrons on the Lady, called the officers, including those of the Fighting 32, to the ready room for a briefing. The Lady's mission now was to protect the Eastern Mediterranean. That included Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, and especially the Suez Canal, which the USSR might try to seize using the North Korean invasion as the pretext. As stated by the operations officer, the looming 6'4" Lieutenant Dick Fowler, known as Dad, the Lady had gone on alert. But the Lady's mission soon changed. By September of 1950, Jesse, Tom, and the rest of the Fighting 32 passed through the Panama Canal and reached San Diego. 6 more pilots were added, bringing the Fighting 32 up to a war-ready strength of 24. Meanwhile, the Marines had landed at Incheon on the west coast of South Korea, heading towards its capital, Seoul. The North Koreans below the 38th parallel were now cut off and in serious trouble. Unfortunately, racism would again rear its ugly head while the Fighting 32 was in California. Jesse, Dad Fowler, and some other members of the Fighting 32 visited the cocktail lounge in a hotel in San Diego. While sitting at a table, a young waiter began taking orders from them. But when Jesse tried to order his drink, the waiter walked away. To his credit, Dad Fowler then loudly told the waiter he had skipped Jesse. But the waiter sheepishly replied, "Sir, I apologize, but we don't serve Negroes." A fuming Dad Fowler then scowled at the waiter, telling him, "You're either going to serve him or you aren't going to serve any of us." Jesse didn't want any trouble and was willing to just leave and meet the others back at the Lady. But the waiter told them he would be happy to serve the rest of the party. An enraged Dad Fowler told the others at the table, "We're out of here." But that wasn't the end of it. As they grabbed their jackets and prepared to leave, a livid Fowler announced to the other wide-eyed bar patrons, "Tomorrow that young man," referring to Jesse, "is leaving to fight the Reds, and these people won't even pour him a drink." Those bar patrons included sailors who also turned to the bartender with angry eyes. The bartender simply shrugged and told them they weren't changing their policy. Dad Fowler then stormed out with the rest of the Fighting 32 trailing behind him. As he left, Fowler would mutter, "This is the only time I've ever regretted wearing the uniform of the U.S. Navy." Tom has also been seated in the lounge of that hotel. That's when the others told him and Bill Koenig, another member of the Fighting 32, that the bar wouldn't serve Jesse. Tom hadn't planned to leave, but his devotion to Jesse was thicker than water or race. So he stood up and told Koenig, "Let's get the hell out of here." Koenig, whose face had already turned red, tossed the newspaper he was reading aside and replied, "With pleasure." By early October, the lady with the Fighting 32 aboard had reached Japan. The lady was now part of the 7th Fleet and would soon steam toward the hostile waters of North Korea. They would be joined by the Philippine Sea, another Essex-class carrier like the lady. Both were flanked by many screening cruisers and destroyers. Meanwhile, the forces of democracy had crossed north of the 38th parallel in pursuit of the fleeing North Koreans. Now off the eastern coast of North Korea, the lady and the men of the Fighting 32 were about to enter the war. The Fighting 32 would initially target the harbor of Wonsan. Only 8 planes from their squadron would take part in that mission, including Jesse's, led by their commander, Dick Savoli. Many of the other pilots, including Tom from the squadron, were up in the Ladies' Vulture Road to watch their Corsairs take off. But one of the pilots, Bill Wilkinson, began waving at Tom to come to his Corsair. After a fairly hazardous journey across a windy as well as slippery deck, Tom reached his plane. Wilkinson was having engine trouble, possibly due to a bad spark plug. Surmising that that was the problem, Tom instructed Wilkinson to rev the engine and lean the fuel so the engine would run hotter. That solved the problem as Wilkinson gave Tom a thumbs up. Around 3 hours later, those Corsairs returned to the lady from their strike on Wonsan. They knocked out some shore batteries and trucks on some islands. One of the Corsairs had taken battle damage. Its left wing was scarred by bullet holes, while the engine cover was deeply dented. Combat footage from that mission was then viewed by the pilots. That footage included Jesse successfully firing a rocket into a cave suspected of harboring a hidden gun. It caused a huge explosion as flames leapt from the cave and smoke poured out the holes in the roof. Even so, Jesse just shrugged and smiled. After Wonsan was liberated, the lady in the Philippine Sea advanced further up the coast. The Corsairs of Tom and other members of the Fighting 32 now hunted for targets in the North Korean city of Songjin. But the anti-aircraft fire there proved to be fierce, a bit inaccurate. Dad Fowler then spotted a bridge in a gorge and dived for it. Tom signaled the others in his formation to also attack and followed after Fowler. The Fighting 32 began dropping bombs. Initially, none of them, including Tom's, hit the bridge. But Marty still had his bomb. He was also desperate for praise from Dad Fowler. When he asked permission to make a run at the bridge, Fowler, after a moment of silence, gave it to Marty. So he dived and dropped his bomb. To likely everyone's surprise, it scored a direct hit. Slabs of the bridge had now dropped into the stream. Getting possibly the highest compliment he had ever received, Fowler's voice crackled over the radio. "Nice job, Marty." That evening, after the attack on the bridge, Jesse sat for dinner with the other members of the Fighting 32. But the black stewards who served them were acting strangely. They soon gathered at the back wall before one emerged with a cake sporting an unlit candle. Jesse's eyes went wide. They're about to celebrate his 24th birthday. The chief steward, also black, then presented him with a package. Inside was a Rolex watch. He then told Jesse, "Thank you for lifting us up. Now on this ship, when a black man passes you in the hallway, you never know, he might be just a cook, or he might be a flyer." Extremely touched, Jesse told all the black stewards, "Thank you all so very much. I hope I never let you down." Jesse then blew out the lit candle on the cake. After their attack at Sonjin, the Fighting 32 got a brief shore leave in Japan. Meanwhile, the ground war in Korea was heating up. The Marines were trying to push the remnant of the North Korean army into China. But now Chinese soldiers were pouring across the Yalu River to assist the North Koreans. Opposition to the Marines stiffened in and around a mountainous region known as the Chosin Reservoir. Even worse, its craggy landscape was becoming a frozen hell as temperatures soon plummeted. By mid-November, the Lady, along with the Fighting 32, was back in the fight. Unsurprisingly, their new target was the Yalu River, and more particularly the twin bridges located near Sunui-ju. The Chinese were using them to cross their troops into North Korea. On November 18, Tom was chosen as one of the pilots to suppress the anti-aircraft batteries guarding these bridges. Meanwhile, Sky Raiders from the Lady would take them out. But trouble occurred before the mission even began. Bill Koenig, one of the other Fighting 32 pilots selected for it, was ill, so Jesse took his place. Even more problems developed. The Corsair flown by Dick Savoli, the commander of Tom's flight, had hydraulic problems. So Tom was ordered to form up with the overall mission commander, Doug Neal. When Tom, Jesse, and the rest of the pilots reached Sunui-ju, black puffs of smoke burst near them from the anti-aircraft batteries below. They then dived on those batteries. As they closed, Tom, Jesse, and the others let loose with their machine guns. They then dropped their bombs. The aircraft batteries below began to go silent. But the Corsairs of the Fighting 32 now faced a more lethal threat, MiG-15 fighters. There were now 14 of them above them coming from Chinese airspace. With a huge speed advantage, the Corsairs were no match for these Soviet jets. The lumbering Sky Raiders were at even a greater risk. Fortunately, Panther jet fighters from the Fighting 31 had shown up to contest the MiG-15s. With the Fighting 31 Panthers keeping the MiGs at bay, the Sky Raiders now came in for the primary part of the mission. They dropped their bombs on the twin bridges. After some initial near misses, bombs from other Sky Raiders hit one of them. The Sky Raiders then pressed their attacks closer to the North Korean shore. Several bombs splashed harmlessly into the Yalu River, but at least one more bomb hit a span near the North Korean shore, causing the smoke to swell across the bridge. The Corsairs and Sky Raiders then returned to the Lady, leaving behind two spans of the bridge sunk in the water. Speaking of bombing the bridges over the Yalu River, this event is also shown in the movie Devotion. Overall, I feel it's a great movie, one I heartily recommend watching. It does a great job of showing the comradeship that developed between Jesse and Tom. That being said, I am puzzled as to why this movie depicted this scene at the Yalu River the way it did. It shows Jesse returning in his Corsair to destroy one of those bridges, thus disobeying orders. Not only is that historical fiction, but it casts Jesse in an extremely problematical light. This movie has much good to say about the comradeship that crosses the racial divide, but it didn't need to undercut it with a false scene that was at best inserted for its dramatic effect. On their return from the successful mission against the Yalu River bridges, the members of the Fighting 32 celebrated in the ladies' dining room. News of the destruction of the bridge buzzed around the entire crew. The pilots of the Fighting 32 also learned that the MiG-15s they were up against had been piloted by Soviets, not Chinese. One of those Soviet pilots had also been killed in the dogfight with the Panthers. That night, Jesse worked on a different project. sketching his and Daisy's dream house. He had only 4 more months remaining in his active duty commitment. By March, he would become a reservist and resume his studies to become an architectural engineer. With his ticket home, Jesse would then build that dream house. But sadly, as well as tragically, that would never happen. By late November, the Marines at the chosen reservoir were about to be overwhelmed by waves of Chinese troops that had crossed the Yalu River. In serious peril, those Marines were also hungry and shivering as the wind howled and the temperatures plummeted to towards 20 below. Those Marines were clinging desperately to a defensive line which protected their main supply route, or MSR. The MSR wound many miles all the way back to its starting point near the North Korean coast. If that Chinese wave of at least 100,000 troops cut off the MSR, those Marines would be doomed to captivity or worse. On November 27, 16 Corsairs, half of them from the Fighting 32, carried out an airstrike to assist the beleaguered Marines. Tom and Jesse were part of that airstrike. They were then forced to land at an airfield in Wonsan because a blizzard set in over the Lady. The tail of Jesse's Corsair had taken damage from anti-aircraft fire, but he believed he could still land on the Lady once the storm passed. While waiting to eat, they then received word that the weather had finally cleared over the Lady. So the 8 Corsairs of the Fighting 32 took off and flew back to it. On December 3rd, Jesse, Tom, and the Fighting 32 flew off the Lady towards the chosen reservoir to support the outnumbered Marines at Hill 1542. Their Corsairs carried highly flammable napalm. They dropped it on the Chinese soldiers swarming around the beleaguered Marines. That created a firestorm of flame that engulfed the attacking Chinese, killing more than 500 of them. Black Marines waved in thanks, as Black Marines below waved in thanks at the Corsairs overhead. As Jesse's plane passed over them, he waggled his wings. One of the Black Marines noticed his dark face as Jesse smiled and waved down to him. That Black Marine then turned to one of his white comrades saying, "You saw him too." His white comrade replied, "See who?" To which the Black Marine responded, "That Negro pilot." The white comrade replied, "Really? I didn't know we had Negro pilots." The Black Marine smiled, "I guess we do now." The next day, December 4, would be a fateful one. Jesse had dropped off the 4-page letter he had written to Daisy in the outgoing mail. Jesse, as well as Tom just behind him, were now on the flight deck of the Lady. Their mission was to again go after the Chinese troops located deep in the rugged and now frigid chosen reservoir. Each of their Corsairs carried rockets and bombs for that purpose. After taking off, Jesse and Tom formed up together as flight partners. While heading northwest of the chosen reservoir, they saw numerous Chinese soldiers below who began firing at them with rifles and machine guns. Suddenly, Bill Koenig spotted a vapor trail from Jesse's Corsair. Although not certain, most likely fire from those Chinese soldiers had punctured the oil tank in Jesse's Corsair. Rapidly losing power, Jesse was too low to bail out. Instead, with Tom's help, he looked for a spot to crash land. Unfortunately, the terrain below was jagged, snow-blanketed mountains, the valleys filled with dead trees. They finally spotted a high, flat pasture on top of one of those mountains. With his engine now stopped, Jesse's dropped down, his Corsair plowing into a snowy slope. Tom circled overhead, waiting for a signal from the radio of Jesse's crashed Corsair, but none came. Jesse's Corsair was an utter wreck, himself pinned within the cockpit. Realizing his dear friend and comrade was in serious trouble, Tom had to make an excruciating decision. Doug Neal had made clear that a downed pilot was to be left alone. Anyone who broke that rule could expect to be court-martialed. Even so, Tom decided it was time to break rules. He then landed his Corsair near Jesse's. Hobbling over, Tom now learned the unwelcome news that Jesse couldn't get out. Try as they might, he couldn't release Jesse from the clutches of the shattered Corsair. Worse yet, smoke was issuing from it that might blaze into a fire. A rescue helicopter had also been ordered to the crash site, but that would take time, and it would soon be dark and even colder than it currently was. To check the potential fire hazard, Tom shoveled snow towards the smoke, which settled into a trickle. He then pulled a net cap over the head of the freezing Jesse, whose teeth were now chattering. Tom was able to plug into the radio in Jesse's crashed plane. He told the others overhead that Jesse was pinned and to have the rescue helicopter bring a fire extinguisher. While Savoli dealt with the rescue helicopter, Koenig radioed for additional airborne firepower. Other Corsairs and Skyriders soon arrived to deal with the Chinese soldiers who were approaching the crash site of Jesse and Tom's Corsairs. Finally, the rescue helicopter made it to the crash site. Its pilot was Charlie Ward. Ironically, Ward had talked to Jesse when the lady crossed the Pacific Ocean from Hawaii to Japan. Described as a jovial Alabamian, Ward could care less that Jesse was black. His job was to try to save him. Indeed, when he found out that the injured pilot was Jesse, Ward responded profanely. That clearly indicated he would do everything he could to help Jesse. But it was now late afternoon, getting darker and colder by the minute. Sadly, even with Ward's help, there was no possibility of removing Jesse from his wrecked Corsair. An already weakened Jesse gave Tom this message: "Just tell Daisy how much I love her." Not long thereafter, Jesse stopped moving. Tom suggested getting a cutting torch, but Ward shook his head. He told Tom that Jesse was likely now dead and that they needed to leave immediately. A dejected Tom then joined Ward in the helicopter. It took off, leaving behind their fallen comrade as the Chinese began approaching the crash site. There was shock, disbelief, and sorrow when the crew of the Lady learned of Jesse's death. The black stewards wept openly. Lee Nelson, Jesse's best friend on the Lady, stood above the bow, cursing the war, cursing the Chinese. A bugler played taps, and Marines fired volleys over the stern in tribute to Jesse. The day that Jesse died, Daisy received the 4-page letter he had written her. Daisy was baffled when she saw a Red Cross worker approaching. It was then that she learned the terrible news of her husband's death. Weeping, Daisy went over to Jesse's father and mother, who had already learned of Jesse's tragic passing. 3 days later, on December 7th, almost a decade after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 7 planes from the Fighting 32 headed for the crash site of Jesse's Corsair. 6 of them would be carrying full loads of napalm. They would give Jesse a warrior's funeral. When they reached the crash site, they dumped their flammable load. Jesse and his shattered Corsair then vanished in sheets of fiery, undulating red. Jesse, the first black naval officer to be killed in the Korean War, would be posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, as well as an Air Medal and Purple Heart. Earlier, members of the Fighting 32 had wanted to provide his daughter Pam with an education. Well, earlier, members of the Fighting 32 had heard Jesse wanted to provide his daughter Pam with an education. A collection was then taken up by the crew of the Lady to create a scholarship for her. Nearly everyone on the Lady contributed to Pam's scholarship fund. In fact, it was later learned that Captain Thomas Sisson, the commander of the Lady, had also donated to that fund. Jesse was truly a valued and respected member of the Lady, including by its skipper. For Tom, who had disobeyed orders in desperately trying to save Jesse, he faced the grim prospect of a court-martial. Having risked his life for his dear but now dead comrade, he was in serious jeopardy of having his Navy career end. Thankfully, instead of a court-martial, Doug Neal, who had issued that order, told Tom, "Thanks for risking your life for Jesse. We are all mighty proud of you." Neal recognized that orders don't really matter when one comrade puts his life in danger to try to save another. Instead, for his selfless act of heroism, Tom would be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He would also receive numerous letters from black citizens thanking him for trying to save Jesse. On January 20, 1951, Tom would receive his Medal of Honor from President Truman, the first awarded during the Korean War. That ceremony was also attended by Jesse's widow, Daisy, who Tom would now meet for the first time. Afterward, both Tom and Daisy remained in contact for at least half a century. Daisy would remarry and then pass away in 2014. In 1968, Tom married a widow with 3 children. He would remain in the Navy, serving in various assignments until he retired in 1973, having reached the rank of captain. He would later die at his home in Concord, Massachusetts on November 13, 2017. As a final tribute, both Jesse and Tom would each have Navy vessels named in their honor. On February 17, 1973, the Knox-class frigate USS Jesse L. Brown entered service. Daisy, Pam, and Tom were in attendance at its commissioning. Over 40 years later, on December 1, 2018, and not long after Tom's death, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Thomas Hudner entered service. Even in death, the names of these 2 comrades in arms would live on. In the military, the bonds formed between comrades in arms are often thicker than water. In fact, such bonds are frequently formed by circumstances that we, who are civilians, don't fully fathom. Those bonds can be so strong that one comrade is willing to put their career or even their life on the line to try to save that of another. In those situations, orders, and especially race, become irrelevant. For such a bond created between Jesse Brown and Tom Hudner, that was most definitely true. If you want to learn more about Jesse and Tom's story, I suggest you read Adam Makoff's book, Devotion. As I previously noted, it was made into a great film of the same name starring Jonathan Majors as Jesse and Glenn Powell as Tom. I would also suggest reading The Flight of Jesse Leroy Brown that was written by Theodore Taylor. Before I end my talk, please note that I am dedicating it to Gail Webster, who unfortunately could not be here tonight. Gail has been a major force in our Martin Luther King celebrations. She has also been instrumental in supporting and promoting these Black History Month talks. For that, I'm eternally grateful. That's it for my talk today. Here's my contact information. Thanks for coming, and God bless.